He walked into that town with nothing but a saddle and silence. She had nothing but tears and a chain around her ankle. He gave away the only thing he owned, and she gave him everything he'd forgotten how to want. This is not just about a horse, it's about what one girl can build from a gift no one else would have given her. Chapter 1. The Trade. The trading post sat like a sunburned skeleton at the edge of nowhere. Boards grayed by wind and time, the sign above its door hanging sideways by a single rusted nail, creaking just loud enough to remind folks it was still there. He arrived at dusk, boots heavy with dust, his coat faded and torn at the seams, and his horse, the last thing he owned that still had a name, limping slightly from too many miles, with too little rests. He didn't speak when he dismounted, just tied the reins to a hitching post that looked ready to snap, and walked through the crooked doorway, the bell above it chiming like a nervous breath. Inside, the air was thick with the smells of tobacco, sweat, and things best left unsold. A man at the counter counted bullets with a bored thumb. Another sat by the stove, eyes closed, pretending to sleep. No one looked up. That suited him just fine. He wasn't there to be seen. He was there because the road behind him had turned into something he couldn't walk any longer. And the road ahead asked for a toll he couldn't pay, unless he gave up the only living thing that had followed him faithfully since the beginning. He had raised that horse from a skittish colt, taught it to ride, to rest, to outlast winter storms and prairie fires. It had never thrown him, even when he deserved it. It had eaten less so he could eat more. It had crossed rivers with its head held high and stood between him and worse things than wolves. And yet, on that particular evening, with the sun bleeding out across the flat horizon and hunger gnawing not just at his belly but at the marrow of his soul, he made the quiet decision that would become legend long after both their names had faded. He gave it up, not for gold, not for land, not even for food, but for a girl. She was sitting in the corner of the trading post, curled up beside an empty sack of grain, her knees drawn to her chest, her hair tangled and matted, and half her face hidden by bruises that didn't look fresh but hadn't yet healed. She couldn't have been older than 16, maybe less, maybe more. It was hard to tell through the grime and the stillness, but what struck him, what stopped him mid-step, was that she wasn't crying like a child. She was crying like someone who had forgotten how not to. Silent, steady, with eyes wide open, tears falling without expression, as if her body remembered sorrow even when her face refused to show it. No one in the room acknowledged her. She was part of the furniture, less than the stove, less than the rifle above the door. When he asked the man behind the counter who she belonged to, the answer came in a shrug. "No one," he said. "Been here 2 days. Don't speak. Eats. If you hand her something. Can't sell her. No takers. Been thinking of turning her out." The way he said it made the decision easier. Or maybe it was already made. He turned and walked back outside, untied the reins, ran a hand down the horse's neck, whispering nothing, just letting it feel the goodbye. Then he walked back in, slid the reins across the counter, and nodded once toward the girl. The man laughed, half out of disbelief, half out of cruelty. "For her?" he asked. Cole, though no one had said his name, didn't answer. He simply took the girl by the arm, gently, and guided her to her feet. She didn't resist, didn't speak. Her body moved like it had no reason left to do otherwise, but still remembered how they walked out together. The horse was gone by, mourning, traded for goods, then traded again, then probably dead in someone else's war. But the girl stayed. She followed him through the empty fields, past creaking fences and burnt stumps, all the way to the place he still called home, even though it barely deserved the word. She hadn't spoken a single word, not even a sound, and he hadn't asked for one. But as the sun set behind them and her shadow stretched beside his, it was clear the trade had been made. And the world, or at least that broken piece of it called Dustvale, would never be the same again. Chapter 2. A name. For the girl, the shack he called home wasn't much more than for leaning walls and a roof patched with tar-soaked canvas. But to the girl who followed him there, it might as well have been a castle. She stepped through the crooked doorway without hesitation, her bare feet silent on the warped wooden floor, her eyes scanning the shadows not with fear but with the strange blankness of someone too used to silence to expect harm. He didn't ask her to sit. She chose a spot near the hearth, curling up on an old rug worn thin by years of forgotten stories, and tucked her knees to her chest the way she had back at the trading post, as if that position gave her bones permission to stay inside her skin. He built a small fire with what wood was left, its flame low and flickering, casting long shapes along the walls that neither of them acknowledged. The kettle boiled slowly. He didn't speak, neither did she. The quiet between them wasn't awkward. It was the kind that settles in when words are too heavy, when breath itself feels like more than enough sound. She watched him from the corner of her eye as he moved through the space, lighting a lantern, breaking bread, placing a chipped mug on the floor beside her without ceremony. She took it with both hands, her fingers shaking slightly from cold, or memory. It was hard to tell which. For 3 days, they lived like that. Sunrise brought gray light through broken panes. He worked the land in silence, pulling weeds from a patch that hadn't seen green in years, chopping dead limbs from stubborn trees, rebuilding the chicken fence with bent nails and patience. She stayed near the house, never stepping more than 20 feet from the door, never speaking, never asking. But she watched every motion, every rhythm, every moment. His hand trembled before he steadied it again. And then, on the 4th day, something shifted. He was mending the porch rail when he heard it's a soft shuffle of her feet behind him, the pause, and then her voice. Just one word. "Marin," she said. It came out like a breath caught in the throat of a memory. Fragile, uncertain, but real. He turned slowly, not wanting to break the spell, and met her gaze for the first time without distance. "Is that your name?" he asked, gently, like asking a ghost for permission to speak. She nodded once. No smile, no explanation. Just that simple act of ownership. A name given, not claimed. A name perhaps chosen because the old one no longer fit, or had been taken, or buried beneath too much weight. From that moment forward, he called her Marin, and she answered, not always with words, but with the smallest tilt of her head or flicker of her eyes. Naming her hadn't changed the silence between them, but it had shaped it, given it corners, walls, a ceiling. It had made the space they shared feel less like a limbo and more like a beginning. In the evenings, he would carve notches into a strip of cedar nailed beside the door, tracking the days since she'd arrived. She would sit nearby, repairing torn cloth or untangling the mane of an old brush horse he'd almost forgotten. And in those evenings, something like life began to grow between the two figures in that wind-bitten house. No questions were asked about where she came from or what had happened before. The past, for now, was something left untouched. But the land began to change. The way light came through the windows, the way the wind didn't sound quite so cruel, the way, every time he said her name, she looked a little more like someone who believed it belonged to her. Chapter 3. Land Without Shelter. The land around the shack was the kind that didn't offer much scrub brush, red clay, stones too stubborn to move, and too many days without rain, but it stretched wide and far. And to Marin, that meant freedom, even if it came with silence and sore feet. Each morning she stepped a little farther from the porch, barefoot still, her movements careful but not tentative, as if testing whether the ground would hold her weight now that she was no longer chained to someone else's choices. He watched from a distance, not guiding, not guarding, just aware, just present, hammer in hand as he fixed fence posts that had nothing left to hold in. They spoke only when necessary. "Water's warm. You hungry? Watch your step." Their simple words, offered like small stones laid across a river, creating a slow path toward something that didn't yet have a name. One afternoon, she followed the dry creek bed that ran behind the house, its cracked surface a mosaic of pale fractures, and returned with a rusted tin bucket half full of wild onions and roots she recognized by smell alone. He didn't ask how. She knew. She didn't say. That night, they ate better than usual, and though neither of them smiled, the meal left something behind, an invisible thread, woven between bites, days folded into one another, soft and shapeless. The wind changed, the sky shifted. A pair of hawks nested in the dead tree by the hill, and each evening Marin sat at the base of that tree, knees tucked in, face to the horizon, watching the birds glide above a world that no longer hurt her quite the same way. One evening, after a long day of hauling timber and clearing brush, he sat beside her under that tree, saying nothing. She didn't move away. The sun dipped below the rim of the land, leaving a sky scraped clean of warmth, and in that cold hush, between light and dark, she spoke again. "You ever think about leaving?" He thought for a moment, then answered without turning his head. "I used to." She didn't nod, didn't press, just let the answer sit between them, like a log left smoldering after a fire. That night, as they walked back to the shack, she reached out and touched the rail he had finished repairing that morning. Her fingers ran across it like she was reading a story hidden in the grain. And then she said, so softly it almost didn't reach him, I want to fix the roof. He stopped walking, looked at her, and in her expression, he didn't see the girl from the trading post, not quite. He saw someone else beginning to step forward from beneath her own skin. All right, he said, and the next morning, she stood on a broken crate, lifting shingles with blistered palms, letting dust settle in her hair like a crown. The prairie was still dry, the winds still harsh, but for the first time, the land felt like it might be more than a place to survive. It might be a place to shape, a place to stay. Chapter 4, The First Brick. It began not with a plan, not with blueprints or grand dreams, but with Marin picking up a single sun-baked brick from behind the shed, brushing the dirt from its edge, and holding it in both hands like something sacred. She didn't say what she meant to do with it. She just walked to the corner of the shack where the wall leaned hardest into the wind and set it down, pressing it into the clay with the heel of her palm. The sound it made was soft, a dull thud that marked the beginning of something no one but her could see. From there, the rhythm formed on its own. She'd wake at dawn, before even the hawks stirred in the trees, wrap her hands in cloth, and start digging, sorting, building. The man he still had no name to her beyond you, watched her from the field as he worked the stubborn soil, and every so often brought over a board, a nail, a bucket of water, saying nothing as she laid the next stone. She didn't move. Quickly she didn't smile, but her movements had intention, as if her hands remembered something her mind had forgotten. Some mornings, she bled, her fingers torn open by splinters or stone edges. He'd leave bandages by the door, and by nightfall, she'd be wrapped and back at it again. The porch came first, reinforced with proper beams so it wouldn't groan under her feet, then the kitchen wall, then the cracked window near her cot. With each repair, she added more than wood or clay. She added weight, meaning, roots. By the second week, she had cleared out the entire back room and swept it clean, even folding the blankets in ways he never had, stacking them neatly, as if guests were expected. She hadn't said it aloud, but the house was no longer just shelter. It was becoming something else. Not a home yet. Home was too heavy a word, but maybe the foundation of one. At night, she sat by the fire with a pencil stub and pages torn from an old ledger book, sketching shapes he couldn't decipher. One looked like a door, another like a chimney. She held the pencil lightly, like it might break if she pressed too hard. "You want more rooms?" he asked once, his voice low from the other side of the hearth. She didn't answer at first. Then, still drawing, she said, "I want space for things to grow." He didn't ask what she meant. Somehow, he already understood. In her silence, she carried blueprints no one else could see. Not for buildings, but for belonging. And so he followed her lead, not because he felt he owed her anything, but because her belief in the work made it feel like a kind of prayer, one nailed board, one lifted beam at a time. By the third week, the house no longer creaked in the wind. By the fourth, she'd painted the windowsills with crushed berries and leftover milk, giving them a hue like pale lavender. The prairie still howled at night, but inside the walls she'd rebuilt, there was warmth and space and air that didn't carry the weight of things unspoken. And when she placed the final stone in the new hearth and lit the flame with her own hands, she didn't smile, didn't speak, but she stood taller, and he, watching her from across the room, knew that whatever came next wouldn't belong to just him anymore. The land, the house, the silence, they were beginning to answer to her. Chapter 5, The Letter from the East. It came folded into thirds, tucked beneath the leather strap of a saddlebag's worn courier, whose boots left shallow prints in the dust, and whose words were as brief as his stay. "For the girl," he said, offering the sealed envelope with a nod before turning his horse and disappearing into the horizon without waiting for thanks or coin. Marin stood on the porch when it arrived, her hands stained from chimney ash and her hair damp from morning sweat. And though she didn't reach for it, she didn't step away either. The man, still without a name she ever used, took the letter, turned it in his hand once, and then held it out. She stared at it, not with curiosity, not with dread, but with a quiet stillness that cracked the space between them. She took it slowly, her fingers light, as if touching it too hard would make it vanish. The paper was creased and sun-bleached at the edges, the ink smudged in one corner where a drop of sweat or rain had bled it. Her name, Marin, was written in a hand that had once known her, or at least claimed to. She carried the letter inside and placed it on the table without breaking the seal. For 3 days, it sat there, untouched. He didn't ask. She didn't explain. But she looked at it often, as though it spoke even without being opened. On the 4th morning, he found her sitting at the table just before dawn, the lamp still burning low, the letter open in front of her, her hands flat on either side of the paper. Her eyes were dry, but there was something in her posture that hadn't been there before, something older, something heavier. She didn't offer the letter to him. She didn't say who it was from or what it said. Instead, she picked it up, walked to the fire, and fed it to the flames, one corner at a time. The paper curled and blackened, the words turning to smoke, before they could be spoken aloud. Then she turned back to him, not with sadness or rage, but with a kind of finality, as though a door she hadn't known was open had just been closed forever. That day, she didn't touch the bricks or the timber. She didn't draw. She walked the perimeter of the land instead, slow and methodical, eyes scanning the fence line, fingers trailing the wire, as if trying to measure what she still had now that something unnamed had been taken from her. He followed at a distance, hammer still in hand, and when she stopped near the eastern edge, the part where the soil was hardest and the wind blew sharpest, she knelt, dug a shallow hole with her bare hands, and buried what was left of the wax seal. Later, when he brought her tea, she took it wordlessly and sat on the porch without looking at him. But that evening, after the sun slipped behind the hills and the shadows lengthened across the floor, she spoke once more. "We need to plant something," she said, "before the ground gets mean again." He nodded, not asking what or why, because he understood, in the way men who've buried too many things come to understand, that planting isn't always about food or beauty. Sometimes it's about anchoring yourself to a place after a part of you has tried to float away. And so they planted, side by side, without knowing what might grow. Chapter 6. When they came for the land, they arrived just after the first rain of the season, when the soil had softened enough for wildflowers to brave their way through the cracks, and the air smelled briefly of something like forgiveness. 3 men, dressed not like outlaws but like bankers' clean boots, papers folded crisp in their breast pockets, and smiles stretched too tight across faces unused to dirt. They rode fine horses and spoke with voices made to be obeyed, and when they dismounted near the front gate, they didn't ask permission to enter. The man who had traded his horse for a girl stepped out of the barn with a shovel in hand, sweat streaking the dirt on his neck, and eyed them with the calm of someone who'd seen every kind of threat before and grown weary of their shapes. One of the Minotas, slick with certainty, spoke first. "There's a claim on this land," he said, "filed before the war. Survey says the border cuts through your fence." He pulled a folded map from his coat and shook it like proof, like gospel. The other 2 stood just behind him, not speaking, letting the weight of paperwork and ink do what guns used to. Maren emerged from the house slowly, wiping her hands on her skirt, her brow furrowed, not in fear but in concentration. She listened as they explained how something on a page signed years before she arrived made her work worthless. How the place she had stitched together with bare hands and broken nails belonged, technically, to a man in the East who'd never seen the sky this far west. They offered compensation, of course, enough to buy passage elsewhere, enough to leave. "You'll be treated fair," one said. "We're not here to hurt anyone." She didn't answer right away, just looked at the land behind them, garden rows starting to green, the fence posts she had driven with blistered palms, the porch rail she had sanded smooth, the room where she had buried her letter and planted marigolds in its place. Then she turned back to them and stepped off the porch. The wind tugged at her hair. The papers flapped gently in the man's hand. She looked him in the eye and said, evenly, "We're not for sale." Her voice wasn't raised. She didn't shake, but something in it made the man hesitate. He recovered quickly, straightened his collar, and tried again, this time more firmly. "You don't have the deed. You don't have the title." She nodded. "But I have roots here. And that paper doesn't." The standoff held for a long moment, the kind of silence that makes birds stop singing and horses shift uneasily. The man with the shovel stepped beside her but didn't speak, letting her stand taller without shadow. The men didn't draw guns, they weren't that kind. But they did leave with clenched jaws and empty hands, dust rising behind their retreat like a warning unheeded. That night, Maren sat on the porch sharpening fence tools, her eyes on the gate, She said nothing, but when the wind blew hard against the shutters and the scent of smoke drifted in from somewhere beyond the hills, he knew she wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Not of men, not of paper, not of the world's attempts to push her from the land she had already claimed, not with ink, but with labor. Not with words, but with living. Chapter 7. The Woman at the Table. It started with one girl, small, hollow-eyed hair, cropped close like someone had taken shears to her in a hurry, carrying a bundle tied with twine, and more fear than belongings. She came just after sunrise, barefoot, lips chapped from too much wind and too little water, and she didn't speak until Marin handed her a bowl of porridge and a cup of warm milk. Then she whispered her name, barely audible, like she wasn't sure it still belonged to her. Marin didn't ask questions. She made up the cot by the stove and left a brush beside the water basin. The girls stayed. A week later came two more, sisters, or maybe just girls who had decided it was safer to pretend they were, and then a boy, no older than 10, who said he was looking for his uncle but didn't flinch when told he might not be found. They came in ones and twos, some limping, some silent, some carrying scars deeper than their skin. None of them asked for permission to stay, and none were turned away. Marin added more cots, then more blankets. She taught them how to heat stones in the fire and place them at the foot of the bed for warmth. She showed them how to grind grain and boil roots, how to braid rope from torn cloth, how to repair boots with wire and patience. They listened. They watched. They began to speak in full sentences. And as the house filled, she built a table. Not just a longer table, but a wide, low one made from mismatched planks, scavenged from the shed and the barn wall, sanded smooth and stained with boiled walnut. It sat in the center of the main room, surrounded by stools and crates and whatever could be sat on. Meals happened there, but so did mending and writing and quiet laughter. The man who had once traded a horse for her mostly kept to the field, now, tending soil that, for reasons no one could quite name, had begun to yield green things again. But every evening, he sat at the end of that table, watching his children once strangers spread jam on bread or practiced reading aloud from water-damaged books Marin had collected in a box beneath her bed. She didn't call herself a teacher. She didn't call herself anything. But when they said her name, they said it with a kind of reverence, not like a savior, not like a mother, but like someone who had once been broken and chose not to let it make her cruel. Word spread, as it always does, and soon the house had outgrown itself. She added walls, dug a well, built the second table. She taught the older girls how to saw boards and hammer straight, how to use a level, how to read grain. She taught the boys how to cook and count, how to carry water without spilling, how to speak to each other without fists. They planted together, weeded together, mourned quietly when a rabbit kit didn't survive the frost. And through it all, Marin never raised her voice. She led by rhythm, not command, and the rhythm took root. One evening, when the sky blushed gold and the fields whispered their thanks, one of the smallest girls asked, "Did you build all this by yourself?" Marin paused, her hands deep in dough. "No," she said, "but I started alone." The child nodded, as if that explained everything. And perhaps, in the language of those who survive, it did. Chapter 8. Fire at the fence line. The fire came at night, not with warning or roar, but with a low crackle that mimicked the sound of twigs breaking underfoot. Subtle and almost intimate, the kind of sound that might be missed if you weren't already awake. But Marin was awake. She often was, long after the others had drifted into sleep. She sat at the table repairing torn cuffs, counting beans, or simply watching the shadows bend across the walls like a language only she understood. It was the smell that reached her first smoke, but not from the hearth, and not the dry sweet scent of cooking wood. This smoke was darker, heavier, coarser in the throat. She rose, without a word, crossed the floor in her bare feet, and stepped out onto the porch just in time to see the orange glow licking the sky beyond the east fence. Not an accident, not lightning. A line of fire, low and deliberate, creeping along the boundary of the land she had stitched into a home. She didn't call out. Instead, she crossed the yard to the barn and rang the old bell that had once belonged to the chapel ruins 3 miles west, its rusted chime trembling through the fields like a whisper of war. Within minutes, figures stirred, small ones, young ones, boys gripping blankets, girls clutching each other by the sleeves. He was the first to reach her side, shovel in hand, already moving toward the fire without needing instruction. They had rehearsed this, not in drills but in instinct. Everybody had a bucket, a line, a rhythm. Children passed water hand to hand, some too young to lift much but helping all the same. The fire wasn't large, not yet, but it was fast and smart and angry. It chewed through fence posts like they were paper, tested the corners of the vegetable patch, threatened the chicken coop with sparks that rode the wind like tiny invaders. Marin moved steadily, sleeves rolled, hair tied, eyes clear. She didn't shout, she didn't flinch. She stamped the flames nearest the gate with a wet burlap sack, her hands blistering through the cloth, her breath measured. And when it was done, when the fire hissed and fell back into embers, and the air hung thick with smoke and ash, and the copper taste of almost cheese stood there, staring at the black line it had left, like a scar across her field. No one had seen who said it. No one needed to. It didn't matter whether it was the landmen from weeks ago or someone newer, someone bitter. What mattered was that the fire had command, the house had stayed. The children gathered on the porch, wrapped in quilts and each other. Someone sobbed quietly. Someone else asked if they would have to leave now. Marin shook her head once. "No," she said. "We build again tomorrow." And the way she said it, without ceremony, without hesitation, was more than comfort. It was command. By sunrise, the damage had been tallied. 23 feet of fence, 6 rows of beans, 1 scorched coop. Not much, but enough to remind them all that nothing was ever truly safe. And still, they rebuilt. Together. Marin drew new plans on the back of old receipts, and the older girls drove nails while the younger ones collected stones for a better fire break. She planted basil near the edge of the burn line, not for flavor but for protection. She said it repelled things. No one asked what kind. And in the evenings, when the wind blew clean again, she sat on the porch sharpening a trowel, the bell still hanging from the awning, like a promise. She had started alone, but she wasn't alone now, and that fire, whether meant to scare or scorch, had only hardened the ground beneath her feet. Chapter 9. The empire she built. It didn't happen all at once. The way stories sometimes claim, no banners, no speeches, no moment where everyone stopped and clapped, but piece by piece, board by board, the place Marin built grew into something that could no longer be called a home, and had quietly become something more. The gardens stretched beyond the fences now, organized in clean rows that curved with the land, filled not just with food but with colors: marigolds for luck, sage for protection, lavender for the nights when sleep didn't come easily. Chickens multiplied, then goats, then 2 stubborn mules that refused to be tethered but stayed all the same. A second house went up beside the first, then a third, each one built by hands that had once trembled but now held hammers steady. The girls she had fed and clothed were no longer children but young women with calluses and plans. Women who stitched clothes from burlap and raised roofs with laughter instead of fear. The boys, once silent and sharpered, learned to build water systems from rusted pipes and coaxed tomatoes out of soil that had once refused to bloom. They came from all directions, now travelers, widows, runaways, orphans, the wounded, the wanderers. Some stayed a day, some a year, some left behind a book, a story, a recipe, a map, and all of it, every piece, was stitched into the fabric of what Marin quietly allowed to grow. She never called it hers. When people asked where they were, the children would just say, "This is where she lives," and that was enough. But those who passed through gave it names: the ridge, the circle, the garden. One man called it the Quiet Empire, and the name clung, whispered from wagon to wagon, across the flatlands, carried on letters written in careful script, and handed from one town to the next. Traders started arriving once a week, not just to drop goods but to barter for Marin's preserves, her woven mats, her honey. They brought iron nails, seeds, paint, even a printing press with a bent arm, and enough spare type to teach a dozen kids the alphabet. She put it in the back room and called it the word house. That winter, the word house printed its first storybook, written by 2 girls who once didn't know how to spell their own names. By spring, they'd printed 20. Her table had doubled in size again. Her fire burned through 3 cords of wood. And still, every night before sleep, she sat quietly by the window, a mug of tea in her hands, her eyes on the edge of the land. She didn't need to speak. She didn't need to explain. The empire she'd built wasn't one of gold or soldiers. It was made from the soft accumulation of care, of decisions taken slowly, of pain carried and transformed, of names remembered and used kindly. And when people rode past now, they slowed down. Some waved, some removed their hats, and some simply looked in awe at a place that had no gate, no guard, but still managed to feel like the safest thing they'd seen in years. Chapter 10. The Man Who Gave His Horse. He spent most of his days beneath the old tree now, the one that overlooked the whole ridge, wrapped in the quilt Marin had sewn years before, his breath slower, eyes softer. From there, he could see the paths carved into the earth, the buildings that stood straight against the wind, the laughter that spilled from doorways once silent. Marin passed by sometimes, older now, but still steady, still carrying more than she let show. When newcomers arrived and asked who built this place, who laid the first stone, he didn't speak of himself. He'd nod toward her and say, "She did." And when they pressed further, when they asked how it all began, he would lean back, touch the brim of his hat, and offer only this: "I had a horse once. I gave it away. She did the rest."